In contemporary knitting, mattress stitch, also called ladder stitch, is often viewed as the best practice technique for joining edges, in part because the seam is invisible from the right side of the work. There are times when you might not want an invisible seam, but instead want to use a visible but decorative seam in your work. In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate just that sort of seam, one that is flat, visible, but also decorative. I'll demonstrate it in both stockinette and garter stitch, and then I'll show you how I'm using this technique in one of my current vintage sweater projects. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter title and starting point of each section. The technique I'm going to show you today for flat seaming came from this vintage knitting booklet from the 1950s. As part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and the 1990s, one of the things I'm looking for is construction techniques that we might not use very often today, or techniques for seaming, that sort of thing, that wouldn't be something that we would normally come across in contemporary patterns. And this particular jacket fit exactly that goal of mine. This jacket is knit in pieces and seamed, and it has a raglan seam line here that is very decorative. You can see that there's this garter stitch, a triangular pattern along the edge, and then the seam is not something that you would normally see in a pattern today. The seaming method is described here, and the instructions say to have the right sides facing each other and oversew the knot of one piece to the corresponding knot of the other piece. So when you look at the selvage of stockinette fabric, what you will see is that you'll have one stitch that looks like a regular stitch, and then the stitch above it will look twisted. And if you look even closer, what you'll see is that this edge right here is like a twisted knot. So this is the knot that we're referring to. When I'm working on a wrong side row, when I get to the last stitch of a purl row, the last stitch that comes off the needle is going to look like one of these regular stitches. And then when I turn the work and I begin a right side row, the first stitch that comes off the needle is right above this other one. And that's the one that's going to appear twisted. It's going to have this little twist right here in the very edge. So we have it at the beginning of a right side row, and then we're going to work all the way to the end of the right side row. And again, the stitch that comes off the needle at the end of the right side row is going to look like a normal stitch. And then when we turn to work a wrong side row, again, we're going to be working a stitch from that same column, and that's when we're going to get the knot. So we're going to get the knot at the beginning of a wrong side row as well. So you're going to have knots on alternating rows. One of the edges is going to have knots on every odd row, and one's going to have knots on every even row. And as you're connecting these knots, you want to connect the knot from row number 1 to the knot of row number 2 to the knot of row number 3. So you're going to end up with kind of a zigzag of seaming yarn going up these stitches, connecting a twisted knot from each row, one after the other. So in order to get started, you have to know whether row number 1 has the knot on this edge or on that edge. If I'm using a cast-on method that requires 2 strands, like the long tail cast-on or the twisted German cast-on, the tail is always going to be connected to the most recently cast-on stitch. So when I'm done with my cast-on, the yarn tail is going to be hanging from that last stitch. That means I'm going to turn the work, and row number 1 is going to have that yarn tail hanging down below it, whether row number 1 is a right side row or a wrong side row. So in my case, I used a long tail cast on, and I like the smooth side of the cast on to be the public side. Some people like the bumpy side. So that means that when I finished my cast on, the tail was hanging here, and I turned my work and I began a wrong side row, and so row number 1 was a wrong side row, and the tail is hanging here. So I know that row number 1 is at this edge, and that's where the bump is, because that was the first stitch of the row, was at this edge. And that's because of a long tail cast on. If I used a long tail cast on and the first row I worked, I decided was a right side row, maybe I wanted the bumpy side facing me, that tail would be over here, and that would mean that row number 1 was at this edge. So it depends. If you're using a long tail cast on, that is right below the beginning of row number 1, and the beginning of row number 1 is where the very first knot is. Here I've got a little cast on where I started with a slip knot and a short tail, and I'm only using a single strand of yarn to create the new cast on loops. So when I finish my cast on, the yarn tail is going to be at the other end of row number 1. It's going to be at the end of row number 1. So I will know that the start of row number 1, whether it's a right side or a wrong side row, is going to be at the opposite end of wherever the tail is hanging. So it depends on what kind of cast on method you use that will tell you where the beginning of row number 1 is. So in my case, because I have a long tail cast on and row number 1 is here, that means this edge has the odd rows, have the knots is upside down. This has knots on the even side. I can consider the cast on edge row 0 since the knots are on 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. So I have my yarn tail attached here, and I like to start seaming by using the yarn tail as long as I can, because it's going to have to be woven in anyway. It's already connected to the work. I might as well use it as long as I can. We are going to go down through the knot on this right edge, and we're going to come up through the knot on the left edge. That means we're also going to come up through the corner of the cast on when we attach the edge. So I'm going to come up through this corner right here. I've got both strands of the stitch at that corner. I'm going to bring this up through here just to connect the two edges. This is not the method that I would use if I were doing mattress stitch, for example, but this is what I'm using for this method. So now I want to insert my yarn needle down through the knot on row number 1, and that knot is right here. That little twist is right there. I'm going to put my needle down through there, and then I'm going to come up through the knot of row number 2. Then I can pull the yarn through. I don't want to pull super tight. I can always tighten things up later. I want to keep it elastic, so I don't want to be too tight. So now I'm going down through row number 3, because that's where the next knot is. And then I'm coming up through row number 4. And I'm going to keep doing that down through the one on the right edge and up through the one on this edge. Now the book called this over sewing. It's also, it could be called, it's a type of whip stitch. So the idea is you're coming over and over and over, but you're coming under the other edge. So you come over and down through here, and then you come up under this way in order to connect them. So because we have two colors, we can see that my seaming yarn is creating these diagonal lines on this side of the fabric. And they're creating diagonal lines on the other side as well, because again, you're connecting 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 back and forth like that. So you see the connecting line right here that goes from an even row to an odd row, and on the underside you'll see from the odd row to the even row. What you'll also see, because we have two colors, is that the stitch that we're coming up through from under, which is this blue one, when we come up through the knot like this, it kind of causes that little knot to become a horizontal bump in the fabric. And you can see that right here as well. That becomes this little horizontal bump. So this is a decorative seam, and you'll see that when the fabric relaxes, this becomes kind of a ditch. And these two edges come together, they almost form what looks like a complete stitch. Not really, they're still separated. So let's take a look and see what it looks like when everything is one color. So this is the sleeve of my 1950s raglan sweater. And you can see how this pulled together has that little ditch in there. And if I pull it apart, you can see both those diagonal threads, but you can see the horizontal. There's a ditch there, just like in woven fabric garments, you can see where the seam is. So let's look at another sweater. This one was actually knit seamlessly in the round, but look at what you see on the side at the transitions from the front to the back. There's this column of stitches with these little bumps. This is a column of garter stitch. So every other round, this column was worked as a purl stitch. And the shaping, the waist shaping was done next to it. So this was used as a signal for where the shaping goes. And it's also used as a convenient way to, when you're blocking it, you can line up these seams straight at the side. If there's any biasing in the fabric, you can help eliminate that. But this was intentionally put in there, this decorative faux seam. There's no need for a seam, but there was a faux seam put in here. And this is actually replicating the look of the actual flat seam that I used in that raglan sweater. So here's a swatch that was done in garter stitch, and it has stockinette selvages. This is not something that you would typically do. But this is what was called for in my pattern along the raglan sleeve lines. There was this garter stitch triangular pattern, and there were these stockinette selvages. So when you use the seaming method, the stockinette has the same bumps in it that you'd have if the whole fabric was stockinette. So when you are doing this seam, you get this kind of very defined vertical edge here, because this is a very horizontal stitch pattern, this garter stitch. But these selvage stitches, the leg that remains of the stockinette stitch is kind of forming this vertical line. So this may not be a look that you would want in a normal situation, but in the case of this raglan sweater, you can see that those are those same vertical bumps there, but it all works together along with the bumps of the seam that come in that kind of form that little ditch that when it pulls in. It all works together to create an incredibly decorative seam. It looks much more attractive than mattress stitch may have looked. The seam itself adds some decorative detail to the result. This sweater also called for doing the flat seams along the sides, and that was a place where I chose not to do that. Instead, I chose to use an invisible seaming method, mattress stitch, which just creates stitch pattern continuity. You can't really see where the seam is, but it isn't flat. So on the inside of the work, there is some bulk. But I felt that for the side seams, I really wanted this particular look. And then I absolutely wanted to use the decorative flat seaming method in this particular situation. And when I seamed the sleeves, I realized I wanted a flat seam for the garter stitch cuffs. So I tried this particular flat seaming method, and it worked okay. I mean, certainly nice and flat. I don't think it looks as good as another method of flat seaming garter stitch that I typically use, which I will link to above. It worked okay, and then I decided to transition into the flat seaming method for stockinette just to see how I would like it. It's not a seaming method I would typically choose in my stockinette sweaters. I prefer the invisible mattress stitch, but this was a nice way to transition from the flat garter stitch into a flat seam. And this is a seam that will be hidden on the underside of my arm, so it wasn't as important to me to hide it. But again, even in seamless garments, a technique can be used to create this faux seam. So this can be considered decorative. You might want to draw attention to your seam rather than to hide it, or you might want to use a combination of seaming methods throughout your garment depending on what effect you want to achieve at different points. Some of you may have noticed that the instructions in the vintage booklet called for holding the right sides of the fabric together when working the seam. For this particular technique, it wasn't necessary, and I found I made fewer mistakes when I laid the fabric flat as I do when I'm working a mattress stitch seam. When sewing the raglan seams, I could confirm that my seams were keeping the pattern aligned at key points. If you're wondering whether a decorative seam might work well for a project you have planned, knit up some swatches in your planned stitch patterns and experiment with different options. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks.